Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of the PR Report. This is episode 7, and today we're continuing our discussion of the sovereign individual, and we're going over chapter 7. So chapter 7 is titled Transcending Locality, the Emergence of the Cybereconomy. And this is a really great chapter. There's tons of fun, useful information in here, and they talk a lot about, up until this point in the book, they've been setting everything up and looking at our timeline from the past and present perspectives. This chapter marks the first point in the book where they start making predictions based on their Megapolitical Analysis into the future. And it gets pretty fun with them talking about how in the late 90s, how people were viewing the internet and the upcoming cyber economy and all this stuff. So to put this into context, they talk about transcending locality, and we need to do a quick recap on what's going on with the books so we can underscore the importance of this transcending locality aspect. So the goal of this book, again, is the authors want to help people transition into the information age in a masterful fashion. That's literally the title of the book. The Sovereign Individual, Mastering the Transition to the Information Age. And so that's their goal. The approach is that they're going to use Megapolitical Analysis as a way to produce more useful forecasts about the future. And chapter 2, episode 2, video 2, going over chapter 2, digs into what megapolitics are and goes over it in fine detail, but is a model of viewing history or reality that allows you to tease out the hidden factors of change, what they call the hidden factors of change that alter the logic of violence. So they're doing that because the theme of this book is the new revolution of power that is liberating individuals at the expense of the 20th century nation state. And we unpack that and dig into that a lot more in the video going over chapter 1. I'll put a link in the description. But this is what the point of the book is. And so now for the first time, we're using this megapolitical lens to make predictions looking into the future. And also to point out that the reason that the goal of the book is to be able to transition into the information age in a masterful fashion is because they see all the stuff that's happening with these microprocessing-based technological innovations that are transitioning society into the information age. It's going to be large-scale societal changes. It's going to affect everybody. It's going to have sweeping changes. There's a lot at stake for individuals, not only for all of us as a group, but for us individually. And the authors want us to be able to take advantage of these opportunities for increased income. Individual has the ability to accumulate greater wealth, achieve greater degrees of individual autonomy, experience monetary independence via cyber currencies, increase self-reliance, and ideally and hopefully more choices through private markets. And so these are all things that they saw coming down the pipeline when this book was written in the late 90s. And so they want to dig into that. And so that's why this chapter is really getting fun, I would say, at this point, because we're using all the lessons and models and examples that have been building up over the previous 6 chapters to look ahead on our timeline and make some fun predictions about the future. And so real quick, the main way that they do all this analysis or their interpretation is through what they call megapolitics, i.e. the hidden factors of change that alter the logic of violence. And again, if you want to dig into this more, I would suggest viewing the video going over chapter 2. I'll put a link in the description. But real quick, they divide megapolitics up into roughly 4 categories. Topography is the main thing in play here that they're trying to get stress in relation to how historically topography dictates a large portion of how violence is controlled by individuals, groups, more recently nation states. And they say that all topographical features that serve as barriers or facilitators to the exercise of power are local. And again, we talked about this previously, how geographical features, the land that people find themselves embedded in, how much of an effect that has in the way society operates and the way humans interact with each other, and ultimately how violence is deployed and monopolized within those regions. And so there are several examples that the authors gave, two of them that are from chapter 2. Early farming societies embedded in arid regions that emerged along seasonal floodplains of rivers and depended on centralized irrigation. That was a really good example of topography on the megapolitical front, and how individuals in that emerging agricultural society were highly incentivized and motivated to work together, because having irrigation for your crops was so crucial. And if you didn't have water for your crops, you couldn't survive. And you didn't have other options to go to, because you were surrounded by deserts and arid mountains, and there just weren't any other options. So that strongly dictated the way people interacted and worked together. And ultimately, the people or groups of individuals that were able to control the irrigation and the water systems had all the power and tended to monopolize control and force, and i.e. violence. Another really good example that the authors had, and again, this is from chapter 2, were the hoplites in Greece. That's a really fun story. I'd invite you to go back and dig into that some more. Put a link in the description to that video. And a couple more that I thought of too in terms of topography on the megapolitical front is this idea of, think about the U.S. being flanked by oceans, the East Coast and the West Coast. We have the Pacific Ocean off the West Coast, the Atlantic Ocean off the East Coast, and essentially we're flanked here in the U.S., which is where I'm located right now in North America, by thousands of miles of water on each side of us. And that's a huge topographical advantage on the megapolitical front, because it's really hard for somebody to traverse thousands of miles of water and bring an armada and attack you. And because of that, the U.S. has been able to not be attacked, and that changes how people who live in this country behave in terms of not having to protect themselves, because you don't have people sailing across the ocean to wipe you out. And you're so far away from people that it's hard for somebody to hurl a missile 3,000 miles and land it on your coast. Another really good example of topography in the megapolitical theater, so to speak, would be Switzerland. Switzerland's basically surrounded by mountains. They're in mountains, and it's just the geography is very treacherous in terms of terrain. If somebody wanted to try to go in and attack Switzerland or overtake them, it's not really going to work out. And that's why they maintained neutrality throughout World War I and World War II, is just they were so hard to attack that the cost of attacking Switzerland or taking them over weren't justified by the returns. It was just too high. And so the authors have several examples of how geography and topography have been strong factors in how the hidden factors of the logic and violence have changed over the years. And they point out that physical difficulties of communication and transport, compounded at most times in places by limited language skills, kept the focus of human action narrow and local. They mentioned that historically, people in societies were locally bound. These days, that's not really the case, because we take traveling for granted. Especially over the last 100 years, there's been a lot of advances. We travel all over the place all the time, but that's a fairly recent phenomenon. And historically, up until the last 100 years or so, and even the last 50, people didn't move around that much. And it was a really big deal to go somewhere. And a lot of people were born, lived, and died never having went more than a mile or two away from their farm or their villages or wherever they were. We have a lot of stories in our culture about the great explorers and people going around and getting on ships and exploring the new lands and all this stuff, but that was more the exception than the rule. That was a really big deal for those people to do all those things, and very few got to do that or got to have those experiences, and a lot of times they died doing so because it was so dangerous. And so we do have all these stories talking about this stuff, but it just didn't happen that much. And an analogy to today, in modern times, it would be similar to going into outer space. So if you were talking to your friend, you met up and had dinner or something, and it was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go into low Earth orbit this weekend and I'll be back in a couple days, blah, blah, blah. That's a really big deal. Like, not a lot of people are doing that. It just hasn't progressed to that point yet for the culture, and that's how travel was up until fairly recent times. Because people were physically, locally bound to where they were, it shaped their mindset, and the assumptions about how to organize society and economics were bound into this mentality. But over the last 100 years, travel has become more commonplace. And if you think about all the things that have been innovated over the last century or so that make travel easier, there's a lot more opportunities. People used to take ocean liners a lot. They used to take trains a lot. Then they started driving cars, and now airplanes. Mostly these days it's airplanes and automobiles. And if you think about, those were all artifacts of people being able to work with steel, aluminum, and oil. And these were technological advances that happened with these base materials that allowed us to build these ocean liners, trains, airplanes, and automobiles that made travel become more commonplace. So you have this interesting phenomena of where technology advances at a base layer with a material from a materials perspective, which is like a lower level part of the system, I would say, steel, aluminum, and oil. Those are advanced first, and then here comes the second layer of advances on top of it: ocean liners, trains, airplanes, automobiles. And because of those multi-layer technological advances that are occurring, we get to travel more. And these improvements are making travel faster, cheaper, easier, and safer. And because they're faster, cheaper, easier, and safer, again, travel is going to become more commonplace and more people are going to do it. These technological innovations took 100, 150 years to unfold. So it took some time and momentum to build up to this point. Now, as a society, we get to reap the benefit of just basically traveling anywhere in the world whenever we want. But this whole idea of technology and technological improvements and working at a base layer and then building on top of that reminded me of an episode I saw of the What is Money series where Robert Breedlove speaks with Michael Saylor. And he has this quote that I really like that kind of sticks in my head, is where he says, technologies that are dominating today are dominating because they're delivering force harder, faster, stronger, smarter. I'll put a link in the description. It's an excellent series for anybody that's interested in basically what's going on in the world today, but it's definitely tinted in the Bitcoin lens, which I find extremely interesting. But that's a really good series. I would suggest anybody watch it. It's super good. So we're shifting this topography on the megapolitical front and realizing that people have historically been locally bound, but then we have these technological innovations, and it's physically allowing humans to move around the earth faster, cheaper, safer, easier. It changes our mindset. It changes the way we're experiencing reality. We get to move around more physically. We get to think about different places, and it changes the mindset and it changes how we interact with one another. Now, what's interesting is because travel has become so much more commonplace the last 100 years, it's deeply rooted into our psyche. And when the internet first started getting talked about in mainstream media in the late 90s, people didn't really have a concept or a clue of what it was. And so this early metaphor of the internet emerged, calling it the information superhighway or the information highway, because people were so travel bound. So I think that this is something the authors pointed out too, is that they missed that with that analogy. It was off base, because really what's going on is the internet was offering an instantaneous transfer and sharing of information everywhere, nowhere, all at once. It's not transit. It's the destination. So being technically informed is not synonymous with understanding the consequences of technology. And they were talking about how, because the concept was so new, they just didn't really know how to even understand or conceptualize what the internet was. They have this phrase in the book that's called tradition of clueless misunderstandings, where historically, anytime innovation is happening, these paradigm shifts are occurring and people just can't comprehend what's going on. And they had several examples in the book. One of them was about the Wright brothers when they were in the process of making the plane, and you had all these experts in physics or aeronautics or whatever saying that it was impossible, you could never make a machine that would fly, and had all these reasons why you just couldn't do it. And so nobody did it until somebody did it, and they did it, and then now, boom, we got the airline industry moving everybody around the world literally every day. So technology changes, and even as it's changing, it's hard for people to fathom or believe that things are possible until they are. So early critics of the internet couldn't see outside of the imagination's geographic tether. And they claimed, again, because they couldn't conceptualize what was going on with it, they just claimed, oh, it's only going to be good for chatting or pornography. And this kind of reminded me of the parallel with the early critics of Bitcoin, who, this is probably like 2011, 12, 13, were saying, oh, it's only good for criminals or money laundering or buying drugs. You just can't really see outside of the paradigm shift or really fathom what's going on. So this was happening with the early days of the internet as well. This is all to undermine the fact that information technology transcends the tyranny of place. It's an infinite non-terrestrial realm for economic activity. Then they jump into, this is where the chapter gets really fun. They jump in and talk about the evolution of the cybereconomy. They broke it down into three aspects of it. So there's the facilitation of ordinary industrial area transactions, novel applications of information technology would then emerge, and then ultimately transactions would migrate outside of the jurisdiction of the nation states. From a financial perspective for all these that I jotted down, where if you're thinking about how the internet, just from the terms of finance, there's all kinds of aspects in the ways that the internet has changed us all or changed the economy and everything. But from a financial perspective, this point one, facilitation of ordinary industrial transactions, would be an example would be your traditional finance banking app. So if you bank at like Chase or Wells Fargo or whatever, they would make an app and then you could interact with them and look at your checking account and blah, 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 do all that stuff. And then they saw novel applications of information technology emerging. So I'd liken that to services appearing on the scene like PayPal or Venmo that are internet first services that wouldn't be around unless the internet existed. Then you got things that are like transactions migrating outside of the jurisdiction of the nation state. And so you fast forward and you have the emergence of a decentralized monetary / energy network like Bitcoin that is completely divorced from any nation state or any government or anything. It's completely its own thing, mutually exclusive. And that's a really good example of that. And they talk about the death of seigniorage. Seigniorage is profit made by a government issuing currency, especially the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs. So they thought that was going to go away, or they're predicting that's going to go away by saying governments will not only lose their power to tax many forms of income and capital, they're also destined to lose their power of compulsion over money. Compulsion, again, is the action or state of forcing or being forced to do something. Another quote from the book. When paper money backed by the state became the approved currency, the changes for amassing capital in opposition to or independent of the state machinery became difficult. They talked about the emergence of cybercash, and they described it as this new form of digital money that's destined to play a pivotal role in cyber commerce. It will consist of encrypted sequences of multi-hundred-digit prime numbers, unique, anonymous, and verifiable. This money will accommodate the largest transactions. It will also be divisible into the tiniest fraction of value. It'll be tradable at a keystroke in a multi-trillion-dollar wholesale market without borders. They nailed it. Bitcoin, boom, right there. I know there's all kinds of altcoins and competitors to Bitcoin, but nothing comes close to doing what Bitcoin is doing in terms of adoption and utility and offering value and a large-scale change on the international monetary financial systems. So the next section they called dialing without dollars. And they talked about there being decentralized. Again, these are all predictions of where they see the cyber economy taking the traditional economy. So they're predicting denationalized cyber money. And again, we just touched on that with Bitcoin. They're stressing the fact that it's going to transcend locality, which makes sense because if you're on the internet, it doesn't matter if you're going cross-border or what, just the whole locality thing becomes less and less important, and there's no borders. Borders don't really mean anything. They talk about no physical reality. And I agree with the authors on this front in the sense that the cyber realm or the virtual realm or the online economy doesn't have a necessarily physical reality, but it's definitely tied to physical reality. And there are physical aspects that it depends on, the infrastructure it runs on, and all the electrical copper wires that are woven around the globe. These are actual physical realities that make it possible for the internet to exist. It's not physical reality necessarily in quote cyberspace, but there's a physical reality to making it work. They talked about no need to put up with degraded monetary value via inflation, which is nice, and a fluidity in shifting in and out of currencies. Not subject to counterfeiting. Paper money is subject to counterfeiting. Cyber money is not going to be counterfeited because all transactions are encryptable and verifiable. The new digital money of the information age will return control over the medium of exchange to the owners of wealth, those people who wish to preserve it, rather than to nation states that wish to spirit it away, which is a nice, refreshing change. They talk about the transaction cost of free currency. Cyber money frees one from the power of the state. National currencies have consistently lost value / inflated over the 20th century. There's no reason currency needs to devalue. The privatization of money, where we'd see private currencies eradicating inflation. And if you're not forced to accept an inflating state-sponsored currency, market competition would force the private issuers of currency to preserve the value of their exchange. Failure to maintain value would result in a loss of customers. And this evolution of encrypted cyber cash will bring this to life. We're definitely seeing things like this happen right now. Eradicating inflation, where they predicted digital money would end inflation and deleverage the financial system. This is really interesting because so one of the hallmarks of Bitcoin is that it's not inflationary. There's a hard cap, 21 million. So there's no inflation on that over the long run. And then they identify inflation as a transaction fee for the convenience of holding a currency inside the wealth tax. Private money will not be inflatable because of competitive market pressures. Higher interest rates, revenue from taxes will drop. Elimination of leverage in the monetary system, altered by competition. We have what these guys call cyber money, which is Bitcoin is on the scene and it's widely adopted more and more every day. And this is putting a downward pressure on the government's ability to tax. Their tax revenues are coming down. How are they going to respond? The authors thought they would respond by tightening credits, higher yields on cash balances, and remonetizing gold, which we haven't seen any of that happen as far as I know. I'm not an economist and I'm trying to learn more about all this stuff every day, but we're definitely not seeing higher yields on cash balances. And as far as I know, we're not in any way, shape, or form remonetizing gold at this point. In fact, yields on cash balances are plummeting and the government's like constantly printing fiat currency as fast as they can over the last 18, 19, 20 months. Yield gap, because it will probably be gold linked, cyber money will also benefit from the appreciation of gold. Okay, so this was a miss. This is not happening at all. Bitcoin is in no way, shape, or form linked to gold. And in fact, nobody wants it to be, and it's good that it's not, essentially. And again, Bitcoin isn't gold backed. It's energy backed from electricity and the whole proof of work. We saw the deflation of the industrial age. Higher real rates will spur liquidation of high-cost, unproductive activities and temporarily reduce consumption. An overall deflationary environment. We're not seeing that. We're seeing an inflationary environment. Now, keep in mind, the authors, when they wrote this book, maintained that from their vantage point in the late 90s, the biggest mega-political factor that would shape the future of humanity or of society was technology. And we're in a situation right now, 20-some years later, where, yes, technology is playing a huge, if not the most crucial part in shaping how things are unfolding around us. But we're also up against mega political factors of microbes with the pandemic over the last year and a half, and a mega political factor of climate. So there's 3 out of the 4 factors that they identified as the main categories of the mega politics of topography, climate, microbes, and technology. 3 of those are in play right now. And there's no way that they could have seen that. And I think it would have been really hard for them to even write a book, because those variables are just so hard to tease apart and understand how they're going to affect each other and interact. Some of this stuff is going to be a hit and some of it's going to be a miss. So an overall deflationary environment, maybe we will get into a deflationary environment, but we're not seeing that right now. We're seeing a highly inflationary environment. And a lot of people think we might be heading into hyperinflation. And again, this is being recorded in November of 2021. Talk to me a year from now, it could be a lot different. I don't know, but that's just where it stands right now. Investor control over capital. They said the ablest investors and entrepreneurs, rather than specialists in violence, would have ultimate control over the capital. I think this ties into these opportunities that are at stake or presenting themselves for individuals right now in the information age as we continue our transition to it, is that people themselves can be more sufficient, more self-sustainable, more autonomous, more sovereign, and make decisions for themselves, be their own bank, deploy their own capital, invest where they want, and be more so masters of their own fate and not have to be at the whim of some nation states going at war with each other and having their lives dictated by that. Yes, those things are going to be happening to certain degrees, but it's going to be less and less as time goes on. They talk about reducing state control of resources, improving economic efficiency, and that's interesting. And again, a large part of what's going to be happening as we continue this transition is there's going to be this continued downward pressure on tax revenues, and it's going to be harder and harder for the government, the nation states, to, quote, redistribute wealth. And we should see more private markets emerging and more opportunities for individuals to make choices about how they consume these services that are typically or traditionally provided from the governments that aren't going to be able to provide them anymore. So they talk about freedom from predatory violence will allow the cyber economy to grow at far higher compound rates of growth than conventional economies dominated by nation states, which sounds great. Setting aside transition difficulties, which could last for decades, the long-term prospects for the global economy should be highly bullish. This is great. They talk a lot in the book too about how when these mega political factors that come on the scene that change society. It's not pretty. It's not pleasant. It's a lot of time societal upheavals, cultural revolutions, things are changing, and there's a lot of growing pains with that. So yes, there's going to be those periods where it gets difficult, it gets tricky, it gets ugly maybe. But in the long run, things should smooth out and we get on the other side of it better off for it. And finally, we have the most weighty single factor of growth have been a reduction in the proportion of resources devoted to war and police. Again, that's coming from medieval historian Frederick C. Lane. They reference him a lot throughout the book. I'll put a link in the description and you should check him out. But yeah, he talks a lot about how the number one priority or the main service provided by the nation state or a government is protection of life, protection of property. And the reason over the last couple hundred years nation states have gotten so huge is because income has been on the rise and they've been able to tax and seize a greater proportion of wealth from its citizenry, and seizing that wealth allows them to have bigger militaries and project force at greater distances and so on and so forth. And so now that we're in the information age or continuing our transition into it, these microprocessing based technological advances that are revolutionizing power and liberating individuals, it is coming at the expense of the nation state because of the downward pressures on their tax revenues. Their tax revenues are falling. They're not going to be able to fund their services or their militaries as much anymore. They're not redistributing wealth. Some people see that as seizing wealth. They're not seizing wealth as much as before. And so that factor is going to be a positive for growth in the future once we get on the other side of this. And that has been the most weighty single factor of growth, has been that reduction in the proportion of resources devoted to war and police. So I hope you find this useful. This book is just amazing because there is so much information in here. And the more and more I read it, the more I think about this stuff and the more it just blows me away how it's all tied together. And I would invite anybody who's interested in this to pick it up and read it. I'm going to continue these discussions. And the next video is going to go over Chapter 8, The End of Egalitarian Economics, the Revolution in Earnings Capacity in a World Without Jobs. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.